Hello, my name is Dr. Jonathan Chun, and I'm a resident anesthesiologist living and working in London, England. This interview is a collaboration between Personalized Educational Solutions and CBTeam, both based in Massachusetts. For this episode, I'm delighted to introduce you to our guest, Dr. Teresa Whitaker, Director of Testing at CBTeam, a practice specializing in assessment and treatment of OCD and anxiety-related disorders. Today, we will be talking about and hopefully answering many of your burning questions about a very hot topic, testing for neurodivergence. We hope to help answer your questions about whether or not testing is right for your child. Some topics we will be covering include: what is testing? What does testing entail? And when should you consider getting your child tested? All right. Welcome, Teresa. Welcome back to another episode of this interview series.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I think last time you were on, you spoke about anxiety disorders and OCD, and sort of touched on what we're going to be talking a bit more today, if that's right.
Yeah, and so last time we talked about kind of how do we tell the difference between an anxiety disorder or OCD and kind of more of executive dysfunction that we would see and things like ADHD. And so
Mm,
today we're gonna talk a little bit more about what ADHD is, how we test for it, and what it can look like. So
great. And some big buzzwords there. And so today's especially interesting for me as someone with ADHD. I think testing for ADHD is something I find very fascinating, as well as because of a lot of, I guess, social media interest and interest with about ADHD and other learning disabilities within schools and other communities. So this is a really interesting thing that I think a lot of people can learn from, I think.
yeah, and you make a good point, and I know we'll touch on it towards the end, but I think with the popularity of social media and TikTok and things like that, I think it's gotten a lot more popularity and just kind of it's more on the people's radar, and for better or for worse, I think it's getting more attention. So, um, yeah.
I think definitely, yeah. Great. So, well, today we're going to be focusing a lot more on the testing aspect, which is something that you and your team specialize in. So, I think I'm just going to kick off and ask, what is involved in testing for different learning disabilities or different conditions?
Many people are probably familiar with the term neuropsych testing. And so essentially what we do is we call it taking a look under the hood. So we want to look at kind of the different patterns that people show in their cognitive abilities, their academic abilities, behavioral and emotional symptoms, and then executive functioning. And so there's a lot of different ways that we do that, but essentially it's kind of a combination of self-report measures, so a lot of um, kind of questions of how well does this sound like it fits you, for the person experiencing symptoms as well as anyone in their life. So that could be teachers, parents. For adults, it could be a partner or a roommate. Um, and then there's a lot of objective measures that we give, and that's to look more in detail at specific types of functioning. So, for example, cognitive functioning, when we give these tests, we're looking at things like processing speed, working memory, verbal comprehension, fluid reasoning, visual spatial abilities. And then we look at academic abilities because sometimes, when we have parents come in and say, my child is just like really, really bright or did really well in school, but something, they made it to high school and something's just not clicking or they're not doing as well as they usually do. So it's important to get an academic sample in these types of tests because it can tell us a lot, especially because the way that we do the academic tests, they kind of build on each other. So we can see kind of at each level, like for writing, for example, we can see, is it a spelling issue? Is it combining sentences, or is it more of a higher level, kind of building an essay or organizing a paper or something like that? Like, where do we kind of see the skill drop off?
Mm,
Um, and then executive functioning testing, we're looking at, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the term executive function is pretty broad and it covers a wide array of different kind of skills and behaviors. And when we look for things through this testing, we're looking at things like working memory abilities, sustained attention abilities, cognitive shifting, so kind of being able to think about one thing and shift to thinking about another thing fluidly. And then at the end of all of this testing, what we do is we kind of lay it all out and look at it all together. And that's combined with a person's personal history, medical history, family history. We like to get a sample from the school. What is their behavior looking like at school? What are the teachers seeing? And then as well as their own self-report, right? Oftentimes we'll have kids report that they're having trouble paying attention, but the parents and the teachers don't necessarily see evidence of that. And so it's good to get kind of a multi-perspective view on what's going on. And then from there, we kind of, look at strengths and weaknesses. So I usually tell parents from the get-go, my goal is usually not to find a diagnosis for a child.
Mm.
I think diagnostic clarity is important. And, if we're coming in with a specific question, we definitely try and answer that. But I think at minimum, we really try and, we're looking into all these really detailed parts of the brain that we don't necessarily get to see isolated as much as we would hope in everyday situations. And we can get a pretty unique profile of strengths and weaknesses with that. And so I think that at minimum is what parents find very helpful with this testing is just kind of figuring out, areas that their kid does really well in and areas that there might be more of a struggle and kind of, using their unique kind of set of skills to come up with specific recommendations that are going to help their kids succeed in life across the board. So.
Wow, that sounds really, really in depth and actually really quite thorough of a sort of assessment of it seems very holistic. It's not just about um, I guess it's not just about whether or not a person's inattentive or has displays certain traits of a specific learning condition. It's sort of everything, kind of assessing all different aspects of their life, not just academic, but also how they're functioning through life, and also even in some ways socially as well.
Totally. Yeah, that's one of the big questions we ask, especially with our middle school kids, our teenagers, and even with our younger kids too. Like, has this impacted their life socially? Are they avoiding
Mhm.
social situations? Do the parents, view their social behavior as concerning? Are teachers viewing it as concerning? So, and sometimes to your point, like that can be a good indicator that something is off as well, right? Like if we have kids that
Mhm.
do really well academically and, they do well in sports, but they constantly get this feedback that they're chatty in class or they need to be redirected or they have trouble socially where, some kids are labeled as bossy or controlling in social situations and sometimes it's kids being kids, but other times there can be something underlying going on that is
Mm.
worth looking into. Um, and it's important to kind of, like you said, like get a holistic view of how the kid is functioning outside of just school and home. And one of the things we try and highlight here. So when they do come for the testing, it's a pretty long day. We usually have people get here in the morning. They're here till the afternoon, with some breaks along the way, but it's exhausting. And
Mm.
kind of two things that we like to remind parents is that that full day from 10 to 2, 10 to 3 is matches up pretty well with what kids would be expected to do in school, right? Like kids get to school in the morning, they're there for a full day, they have breaks and, different specials that kind of allow them to have more of a brain break. But
Mm.
in reality, we're expecting these kids to be able to go to school for, 6 hours, and then some of them have after school activities. So even when we have kids come in for testing and, they start to really look fatigued or struggle to keep up or, lethargic a couple hours in, that can also give us data because that might show us like this might be a kid who is really struggling to get through the school day.
Yeah.
And with that, like the testing environment is by design, kind of isolated from any distractions, noises. There's no window in the testing room, so it's quite
Mm.
boring, but it's individualized one-on-one attention in a controlled environment. So a lot of times, to your point, like when we're looking holistically, we get reports from the parents in the school about how the child typically does, in different subjects. And oftentimes, for example, if we have a kid who doesn't do very well in math, we're seeing low math scores in school, trouble with homework. Sometimes these kids come in and they do perfectly fine or better than we would expect in the testing setting. And some of that we can say, maybe there wasn't a time constraint or maybe there wasn't distractions, right? And so sometimes it's just comparing their performance in a controlled environment versus not, because if there's a pretty stark difference, that can be pretty indicative in itself of, why was there such a difference in performance in this setting versus this setting when the expectation is, essentially the same. So,
Wow, so yeah, really having that sort of full day of testing and evaluating really does help to emulate a typical school day, which is so interesting. I never really actually thought about that. But yeah, I could imagine
Yeah.
that towards the end of the testing or towards the end of the school day, you know, attention might drop off a lot quicker and you know, they might have difficulty with following and things. That's very interesting. Now, so you've mentioned that it's sort of like like a almost like a full day, pretty much a full day ordeal. What are some of the tests, or are there specific tests, named tests that a provider can run to reveal some underlying, you know, learning disabilities?
So typically when we think about like learning disorders and we'll kind of use this term interchangeably. So
Mm,
learning disorders, the kind of the clinical term. So when we have somebody come in and they are identifying learning challenges and based on the DSM criteria, they meet criteria for a learning disorder, that's what we diagnose it as clinically. I know the schools tend to use slightly different language, and that is mostly for like the qualified services that they may or may not put in place, and even just being able to talk about it kind of on an everyday basis. Sometimes when we, or a lot of times I should say, when we do identify a learning disorder, those kids are going to need some sort of support throughout the school day, and that could be a small group where they're in the same classroom as everybody else, but maybe they're working off to the side with a couple other students and another teacher.
mm,
Sometimes they pull the kid out of school. So I think that's a very common question that we get is, is this a learning disorder? Is it just,
mm,
normal kind of variation and doing well? And so what we do, so the different types of testing we do. So we have the cognitive testing, academic
mhm,
testing, and the executive functioning. So to identify a learning disorder, I would say we look at kind of two main areas. And when it comes to testing, the cognitive functioning is the first piece that we want to look at. And so just a quick, I guess, background on what cognitive testing is and what it's helpful for. So
mm,
a lot of people know what IQ is, or they think they know what IQ is, right? It's a buzzword that I think gets thrown around for probably has for decades, but what it really is intellectual abilities, right? And so when we look at this cognitive testing, we have an FSIQ, which is the full scale IQ. And that's basically saying when we look at all of these things together, this is kind of where this child sits compared to children their age. Um, Within that profile, however, we can learn a lot. So for example, if we have a kid who comes in and their verbal abilities are above average, their visual spatial abilities are above average, their fluid reasoning is above average, but their working memory and their processing speed, either both or either one, is a little bit low. That is kind of my first indicator of like something's a little off, right? Like in theory, most people have variation in their own intellectual abilities, but having that significant gap between kind of what we call like the more stable abilities, so the verbal abilities, visual spatial abilities, and then the more variable ones like working memory and processing speed.
mm,
The gap between that is usually an indicator that something's going on. And that could be an attentional issue, that could be lack of sleep, that could be lack of nutrition, it can be distractibility. So, I usually take that with a grain of salt because, like I said before, it's kind of one piece of the puzzle. But when we look at learning disorders, the academic piece is kind of a nice complement to the cognitive assessment, and that's what really helps us decide what's
mm,
going on. So we look at math, writing, and reading, and like I said, we kind of look at it at different levels. So at the very basic level, are they able to read sight words? Can they? We have a couple like silly words on there that aren't real words, but they're the goal is to understand if they understand phonemes and the phonetic relationship between words and sounds and letters. And so
mhm,
um, when we see, so going back to my example, if we have a kid whose verbal abilities are, let's say, one standard deviation above average, and their academic portion of the test shows that they're falling a grade or two below grade level, right? So let's say we have a kid in sixth grade and he's tapping out right at like fourth grade reading level,
mm,
and there's really no kind of like logistic reason why we would expect that to be so low, right? Like, so cognitive abilities in general tend to stable out when a child is in about third grade. And then we would expect those abilities to stay pretty stable up until adulthood. And then we start to see a little bit of a decline. And again, it tends to be more with the working memory and processing speed, just because
mm,
those two areas are a little more sensitive to kind of everyday things that could come up.
mhm,
Um, so to be diagnosed with a learning disorder, we kind of have to prove that there's no like underlying cognitive deficit, right? So we know that this kid has average or above average intellectual abilities. We know that the kind of hard wiring is there, and
Yeah.
the, the, I guess, outcome is not what we would expect. And so, with that, so the DSM criteria has a couple other caveats there. And like one of the things that they say is there has to be some evidence that we've tried, a legitimate curriculum for this child, and they are still not, picking up on different skills. So there kind of has to be some evidence of trial and not success,
Mm,
to be able to say like, yes, like this is a learning disorder, right? And
yeah.
a lot of times to that point, learning disorders can happen for a number of different reasons. There's a lot of evidence to show that they run in families. There is a genetic component. So,
Mm,
if mom has, let's say dyslexia, there is a heightened chance that the children are also going to struggle either with dyslexia or dyscalculia or,
mm,
other types of learning disorders. And it's very common to see learning disorders co-occur with attentional issues. So
yeah.
they can happen on
Okay.
their own. We
Yeah.
can, separate and still happening, but a lot of times, we see a learning disorder either happen at the same time as an ADHD diagnosis. Sometimes the learning disorder happens first, and then we kind of see more of a global deficit with executive dysfunctioning. But um, I think the learning disorder is interesting because it's something that can be diagnosed in the schools.
Mm,
I will throw the caveat out there that schools, when they do find a learning disorder, that typically warrants putting in an IEP, which we'll talk about in a little
uh,
bit. And IEPs typically require resources from the school to kind of help change the curriculum so that this kid
mm,
is, getting the information in a way that makes sense to them, that they can easily access. But obviously, that comes with its own kind of set of challenges with
yeah.
school personnel and staff. Um,
So I have
so yeah.
two questions about what you've just told me. Firstly,
Sure.
is you've mentioned all these sort of tests. Are they age adjusted? Are there specific ages that, and also are there specific ages that you think are, or in your professional opinion, that are best for evaluation? Because obviously, if the child is too young, it might not work. It might not be as clear. So, firstly, I guess, is it age adjusted? And secondly, what age range is sort of most ideal for testing?
That's a great question. I actually don't get that one a lot. Glad you asked. So it really, as far as the kind of age adjusting goes, so all of the tests that we give are normed to the child's or the adult's specific age or grade. So I say both because for the cognitive testing, for the executive functioning, we look at their age. So is these, kind of abilities and behaviors that they're showing appropriate for their age? Grade for the academic testing, we actually do grade based, because there's usually a variation. Like second grade, for example, you could have kids that are 6, 7, or 8. So it's not really fair to compare, an 8-year-old in second grade to a 6-year-old in second grade, even though they're being kind of shown the same curriculum. Like we want to kind of compare it to what their expectation is, less so like what the average 8-year-old is doing compared to the average 6-year-old.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, so as far as like age of like what we can start testing people when it's helpful. So things like autism, we can actually diagnose as young as 2. So sometimes there are toddlers that start to show signs of autism early on, and we always recommend like if you have a hunch, if you're concerned about any developmental issues, like the earlier the better. Earlier intervention has been shown to be a huge kind of path adjuster for kids that get caught early. And that's for,
Mm,
it could be anything like sensory sensitivity. Sometimes there's fine motor delays, but especially with things like autism,
mm,
if ADHD is pretty severe, the earlier we can kind of catch these things and put interventions in place, the better outcome the child is going to have. So as far as age of diagnosis, I would say for autism, we see kids as young as 2 come in, all the way up until adulthood. I will say we tend to see less adults that come in and want that diagnosis or are
mm,
curious about that diagnosis. It's typically something that is caught or identified in childhood, or at least patterns of it can be traced back to childhood.
mm,
Um, and then I would say with learning disorders, I would say that would probably be that with ADHD would be the next kind of earliest thing we can catch. So, with the exception like kindergarten, there's a lot of variation. Some kids are writing their names, some kids are still learning how to write letters. And so, I would say by like second grade, second or third grade, there's a more of an expectation of, skills build on each other. So I would say learning disorders tend to emerge around second or third grade at the earliest. But there's kids that it doesn't get caught until middle school. I've had kids
Mm,
where it doesn't get caught until high school. And sometimes kids even kind of figure out a way to get by
yeah.
even to college. So I would say like the earlier you detect that something could be wrong, the better.
Mm,
A lot of kids or a lot of parents will come in and say, like, for example, if I have a 6 or 7 year old that we're looking for ADHD, they're still within that window of, kind of what's normal child development versus what's abnormal. And
yeah.
so a lot of parents will ask, is this just kind of normal kid behavior? And sometimes the honest answer is it could be, right? And so
Yeah.
what I usually will say to parents is even if we're testing them, at age 6 or 7, kind of before we would expect some of these behaviors to stabilize out or these abilities to stabilize out, it's still good data because if, let's say, 4 or 5 years later, attentional concerns are brought up again, we kind of have like a history of, okay, well, this is actually something that was present early on.
Mm,
Um, and it's also very helpful too, and more so again, like kind of getting ahead of the curve because a lot of times we'll have kids come in middle school and they're showing symptoms of anxiety and depression and ADHD.
mm,
And,
yeah.
obviously those are three very separate diagnoses, but a lot
Yeah.
of times it's helpful to get a timeline of,
Of course.
did you start to see ADHD symptoms and then anxiety and depression kind of
Mm,
followed, or
mm,
did you
mm,
start to see some mood symptoms and then you saw a decline in executive functioning? So even if it's, early to get tested, I think getting a good baseline for some of these areas of functioning is good to do young
yeah.
because I mean, I've had times where I've tested someone in middle school and they've shared with me their second grade testing, and it's been immensely helpful because we can
Mm,
see, like again, like somebody with low processing speed, if they come in at 7 years old and they have really low processing speed, that could be a one-off, right? Maybe they were just really distracted, they didn't get
yeah.
good sleep the night before. But if that same kid comes in seventh grade and still has a very low processing speed, I would question, you know, is that more of a trait, right? Like, is
Yeah.
that more of something that they struggle with daily versus just, maybe a blip in the data? So,
Yeah. Interesting. Now, you mentioned earlier that there's a part of your assessment is showing a made-up word to a child to see if they can sort of sound it out. So there's some children who don't really understand phonics or who don't work with phonics. And so how does that play into this type of assessment?
it's a good question. So there are kind of more nonverbal modalities of assessing things like intelligence, things like
Mm,
behavior. We at our clinic don't tend to do as much of that type of assessment. But I will say, like, if we were to have a child come in and let's say the question was autism,
mm,
and they already had an autism diagnosis, but we were trying to get a sense of their intellectual ability. There are nonverbal kind of ways to look at intelligence, and some of it might be looking at puzzles, for example. Like one of the tests that we give is, it's you're kind of looking at like a matrices of designs, and you have to pick which one comes next. And so for children that we know have identified, I guess, like deficits or weaknesses in areas like verbal abilities, there's other ways to kind of get at that information that we're looking for.
mm,
Um, but I would say in general, we don't typically see, I guess, like that population. Yeah.
mm. Okay, fair enough. And so you touched on this term just ever so briefly earlier, neuropsych testing and also psychoeducational testing. So these are two distinct types of testing. And so what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, psychoeducational testing is a combination of cognitive assessment and academic assessment. And so, typically that is testing that's done in the public school system. There are sometimes private schools that offer it as well. They usually contract out with somebody. But those are, again, it's kind of the bread and butter when you're looking for something like a learning disorder. So, schools can diagnose learning disorders. Like I said, there's some politics behind that, so they tend
Mm,
to try and kind of show what the best of the child's abilities, which we want to do that here too. But
mhm,
so psychoeducational testing is that same cognitive testing that we do here. So again, looking at things like processing speed, working memory, verbal abilities, and then that academic piece. Sometimes I will see with psychoeducational testing, they'll do a separate behavioral and emotional evaluation, and those are typically more of the broad self-report measures that are included in ours. And usually that can be kind of in itself enough. Like, again, sometimes that identifies a learning disorder. It's detailed enough that we can come up with an IEP, put a plan in place, and the kid is ready to go. Other times we will see something that's inconclusive, or sometimes the parents are like, this doesn't really give me a full picture of what's going on. So that's typically when they'll seek out the neuropsych. So the biggest difference
Mhm.
between the psychoeducational assessment and the neuropsych assessment is, kind of looking more in depth at some of those learning and memory profiles. So we look in depth at verbal learning versus visual learning, delayed learning versus immediate learning. In the context of verbal learning, can they remember more things when there is, a context or a story that goes with it versus just rote memorization of a list of words?
Mm.
So part of the neuropsych testing is to kind of get a really good sense of, how does this child remember things, right? Like, you're giving a lot of information to a kid. How are they coding this in their brain? Are they having trouble coding this in their brain? Or are they coding it fine and then it's the retrieval that's an issue, right? Like, they're having trouble coming up with a word that they learned when the time is right,
Mhm.
right? Um, and then the other piece we look at is like memory and kind of how those two things play into effect, right? So there's tasks where we'll show the kids pictures where they have to recreate the picture or they have to identify what they saw. And again, it can just be a good kind of way to look at how a child remembers things and learn things, which they don't go in as depth in the schools.
Mm.
And then the other kind of piece to that is this more in-depth look at their executive functioning. So things like sustained
Mm.
attention. So we
Yeah.
have a computer measure that we give here that the child sits at a computer, it's 14 minutes long, and they have to attend to a task for 14 minutes without a break. And it measures down to the millisecond, how quickly they're responding, if they're missing targets, if they're inappropriately responding. So that can give us a really good indicator if there's things like impulsivity, inattention, um, and then even just vigilance, right? Like, a lot of kids with ADHD tend to, or even learning disorders, like, tend to exhaust much quicker than the neurotypical kid, right? And that's because they're working so much harder mentally to keep their head above water or, match up with the rest of their class. And so that is another thing we look for in testing is like, are they, I referred to it earlier, but are they getting exhausted by 10 o'clock?
Mm.
Could it be an anxiety thing? Could it be an attention thing? And so that neuropsych kind of just fills in the gaps, I would say. Like, that's what we call it here, is like filling in the gaps of
Yeah.
what the psychoed testing does, in the sense that it provides more context of, if this person has low processing speed, we're kind of taking guesses as to why with the psychoeducational testing versus
Yeah.
if we look at the neuropsych, we can say, oh, it's because they have trouble initiating a response or they have trouble shifting between different topics and that kind of slows them down. Or when they're under a time constraint, they freeze, right? And so
Mm.
it kind of gives us more of a broad look at what else could be contributing to those scores that are very helpful, but
Yeah.
without additional data points can sometimes be misinterpreted or misdiagnosed. So,
Okay. So a neuropsych test, neuropsych assessment is really good at filling in the gaps that, that might be sort of left behind from a psychoeducational assessment. But do you ever find that it's also it also applies the opposite way, where you need the psychoeducational assessment to fill in gaps that the neuropsych might not have found?
yes, absolutely. And that actually is kind of what we talked about in the last time I was here. So when you think of this testing that the schools do, they do a great job with the cognitive testing and the academic testing. And then typically a neuropsych focuses more on kind of the latter portion of that,
Yeah.
right? So more the executive functioning, memory, learning, personality, sometimes they'll throw in there. But in my opinion, and they usually do the cognitive testing, but I think academic testing is sometimes left off with neuropsych testing, which I
Mm.
think is very important. Like I said, if we have a kid,
Yeah.
there's patterns in the academic data that can be really useful. So, for example, a lot of times when I have kids that have ADHD, they do very well academically, right? They tend to be really bright kids. Where we tend to see kind of a deviation or variation in their score is on time tasks or things that involve higher order thinking. So sometimes that's, a kid does really good in spelling, they can combine ideas in a sentence great, but then when we see them write an essay, it's disorganized, there's punctuation missing, there's run-on sentences, and that's another data point that I think people forget that can be used in tangent with all of these other pieces of data, right? So, same thing with reading, right? Like we have kids that are like crazy good readers, like they read, well above their grade level, but when it comes to comprehension, there's a huge gap. And that's
Mm,
another thing that
mm,
can kind of signify to us. Like if this is a kid who has, above average fluency, above average sight words, but then can't understand something that they read or something that was read to them, that could be, a learning disorder with comprehension, or it could be an attentional issue or a
mm,
memory issue, which again, sometimes even with that, right? Like sometimes what could be a memory issue is actually an attention issue because the information that was provided was never coded to begin with. Um,
interesting.
yeah,
Oh
so
gosh,
it's
this
cool
is,
stuff.
yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
And so obviously there are huge benefits of getting tested and I guess for parents who are concerned about their child's other performance or maybe perhaps even maybe like a change in personality if they're struggling at school, for example. So what are the pros and cons of getting tested for a learning disability? I guess not just relating to academics, but even sort of beyond that and how it might help in their life and sort of in a more holistic picture as well.
I think I can't think of too many cons, but for the sake of argument, there's got to be a few. So I would say for most parents that come to us, at least, I would say price is probably the biggest barrier, which was unfortunate. I always tell parents if I had the choice to give this testing for free to everybody, I would, because I think it's
Mm,
so helpful. But typically, I would say the biggest barriers to doing the neuropsych testing is cost. And then if it is a place that cost is not an issue, it's usually a very long wait list. And so
mm,
what I tell parents is like, it's tough because let's say the beginning of the year, their kid is really struggling in middle school, they call a place and it's a 9 month wait list, which is pretty typical. Like that's around the ballpark of where a lot of these places are. I mean, that's a full school year, right? So
yeah.
like to wait a full school year to find out if your kid has ADHD, to find out if your kid has a learning disorder, depending on what year in school that is, that could be really formative and really impactful. So um, but again, I know it's a cost thing, it's a wait time thing. I think those are the biggest things. I do have a lot of parents worry, if we do this assessment outside of school,
Mm,
typically when we do the neuropsych here, we get into more like in depth with background history, right? Like we go more into family history. What is home life like? Um, you know, what does it look like outside of the school setting, outside of the public setting? And typically we get a lot more information in background than the schools do. And so sometimes parents are worried about their personal information being shared with the school. So, if they come in for a private evaluation and, we put in there some family history or some incidences that the school didn't know about, and then the school gets the report and, parents worry that they will be looked at differently, that their child will be treated differently.
mm.
So I would say those are the cons, or I guess like the questions that people have mostly, or that
Especially in
becomes a
school when
barrier.
like sticking out is never a good idea, like no matter what it's
Right,
about, what it's for,
right.
even if it's for something great, you still just don't want that when you're in school. Just kind of just, yeah.
Yeah. And then
Interesting.
as far as the pros go, I could probably talk about these all day, but I'll keep it brief. Um, but I mean, just at minimum, and again, going back to what I was saying before, like my goal is never to find a diagnosis. Like I'm not diagnosis hunting when I do this type of testing. Like
Mm,
I'm genuinely, looking at a broad range of abilities and then kind of putting it together in a way that would make sense and be helpful for someone who would read it. So, like I tell parents, like at minimum, let's say they really think it's ADHD and we do this testing and it's not ADHD,
mm,
and that, that could be something parents worry about. At minimum, we still are able to say, okay, it's not ADHD, but here are some areas of weakness that might be getting in the way of your kid's academic performance or, their social interactions, or this might make things
mm.
easier around the house to make sure chores are getting done and there's less stress for the family, right? So,
Yeah.
I think and a lot of times too, like when I do the feedback sessions, parents will say, oh, this sounds just like so and so to a T, which is great. Like we want to hear that, right? Like we would hope that when we do kind of, unrelated objective testing, that there would be patterns that we find that can be translated into, a behavior or a skill that the parents are seeing in everyday life. And so, So sometimes it's just confirmation, like, kids, parents will say, my kid is a terrible listener. They have to see something to remember it. And sometimes that's true.
Mm.
And sometimes just seeing it and saying, like, yes, like, and this is the statistical difference. Like, this is actually how much better your kid
Mm.
is likely to remember something told to them versus something shown to them, right? Um, and I think for parents too, like, we like to go pretty in depth with these recommendations because if we're doing all this assessment and not giving specific recommendations to each child, we're not really doing our job. And so,
Yeah.
even on the level of providing intervention or recommendation, treatment recommendations, we break it up into, these are things that might be helpful in therapy to focus on, right? If the child already has a therapist, here are some areas that you might want to shift focus on, or here are even some modalities that might be helpful, right? Like, for example, ACT is something that we use frequently in our clinic to treat anxiety, to treat OCD. It's a very analogy heavy approach for
Mm.
someone who has abstract thinking and does well kind of connecting to different ideas that aren't necessarily connected. ACT might be a great modality for them. That's
Mm.
something they might do really well with. And then like med recommendations. So like as a psychologist, I can't prescribe, but
Mm.
I can say, we've diagnosed depression or we've diagnosed ADHD. Here are the medications
Mm.
that are shown to be most effective in combination with therapy.
Yeah.
And then we usually provide a pretty lengthy academic um, intervention list. And I usually give more than what's needed just because I'd rather the kid have more and not use them than have not enough.
Yeah.
And then there's a section at the end that we kind of give to parents and kids, like more of like a self-care. So like cognitive shifting, for example, is something we see very frequently in kids with autism, kids with ADHD, kids with OCD. And so sometimes I'll suggest little kind of tidbits of ways at home that you can increase cognitive flexibility in a way that's not, um, very formal. Like, maybe it's brushing your teeth with your opposite hand or
Mm.
changing the rules to a board game, like things like kind of little changes that parents can make at home to help support areas of weakness that we identify. So,
This is so
yeah,
interesting. It's so there's huge benefits, really, and from
I
what
would say so.
from what you're telling me, it's almost as if like even if a parent comes in with a specific diagnosis in mind, even when they leave without a diagnosis, they still hopefully have the tools that they need to address the concerns that they came in with at the very
Right,
least. And so
right.
that's a huge benefit for them. Now,
Yeah. And oftentimes, oh, sorry.
no, no, Karen, sorry.
I was gonna say, depending on how old the kid is, like we'll actually type up a feedback kind of in their language. And, if it's a kid in like fifth grade, we, water it down a little bit and say, like, hey, you do really well when you have, a table in front of you to
Mm.
remind you, of what you have to do today. Or you might struggle if you read something once. It might help if you, use a tracker or a piece of paper to kind of help go down the page so that you don't lose track of where you were on the page.
Mm.
So I think it's helpful for parents, but I also think it's helpful for kids too, again, depending on the age, to kind of learn about how their brain works, because
Yeah.
especially kids that come in and they're like, I'm terrible at math, I'm stupid, I'm never going to do good at
Mm.
math. Sometimes when we find a learning disorder, ADHD, it helps kind of normalize like you're not stupid at all. Actually, like that, you just have a brain that is really, really verbal, and these are the
Yeah.
ways that we can kind of help the math part, right?
Sort of like I think when I was in school the term used was like cope not coping strategies but sort of like study skills and
Yeah,
things like that we can use to help mitigate the effects of having some degree of neurodivergence. But
totally.
do you mind just briefly defining some of the terms that you've been mentioning? So like cognitive flexibility?
Yeah. So cognitive flexibility in broad terms is the ability to kind of mentally switch from task to task. So a lot of times that's exactly what it sounds like. So if I'm writing an email and I have to switch over because I have a patient coming in, I kind of have to switch my mindset of, all right, like kind of catch up on what I'm doing, put myself in this, person session. Like difficulty with cognitive shifting might be, I'm in the first 10 minutes of that session, I'm with that person, but I'm still thinking about that
Yeah,
email, right? Like I had a hard time kind of
got it.
transitioning over. But that could also look like sometimes like multi-step directions, right? So like I want you to go brush your teeth and then go pick up your laundry. Like that's a working memory thing, but there's also some cognitive shifting and okay, I have to change what I'm doing, initiate this task, and then switch from that task to another task with the
Hmm.
idea that, there's this kind of big task at the end that these are all going to play into. So,
Got it.
Um,
And
yeah.
how about and cognitive shifting? So is that sort of similar then? So cognitive shifting is what you're doing when you have cognitive flexibility?
So yes, yes. So if you have cognitive or good cognitive flexibility, your ability to shift cognitively is
Yeah.
pretty fluid, right?
Okay.
Versus like,
Yeah.
kind of getting stuck, we call it.
Yeah.
So
Okay, great. Now, let's say I'm a parent concerned about my child and I really want them to get tested. So, what are ways you mentioned previously, with schools and things, but what are some ways that I can go about getting my child tested? And specifically, what are the different ways that this assessment can be paid for, or are there some free options, or with public schools, are there other options as well?
yeah. So I always tell parents it is your right as a parent to flag the school if you feel like something is wrong. And that doesn't have to be academic, right? Like if you're concerned about your child's behavior in school, if you feel like they're, disengaged in some way or they're not meeting their full potential, as a parent, you can request that the school do an evaluation. Typically, the school will kind of do what they see fit based on the question, maybe based on what they're seeing, and that usually like I said, it entails the cognitive testing, the academic testing, and then if there is a behavioral or an emotional concern, they'll usually put on a couple of those measures. And that is free for parents in the public school setting. So any public school district, if there is a concern, sometimes teacher can raise the concern too. Like oftentimes it's the parents, but there are times when the teachers will say, hey, this kid's just not either adjusting to the rules or they're just not meeting this mark and they will bring up, kind of the recommendation to get tested. So, where we pick up is, like I said, kind of filling in those gaps. So I usually tell parents if they have had testing done at the school and they have the cognitive measure, they have the academic data, and as long as it's done within the last 2 years, we'll usually use that data and combine it with our data, which saves time and money on our end as far as those are tests that we would have given, so it kind of knocks off some of the price
Mm,
at a private clinic. But I think the only and sometimes that's enough, right? Like sometimes parents are just curious, is this a learning issue? The school says yes, the school says no, and it stops there. I think where we tend to see, like, is there more of a question is if it's a more nuanced, like mental health condition. So things like OCD, like we are very savvy with. I would say
mm,
most of the schools I work with only kind of know it on a surface level or, what they see or if they've had a kid that they've worked with that they've had OCD, but I would say more nuanced mental health conditions that are kind of above and beyond depression and anxiety, I
mm,
feel like aren't usually caught as well in the school setting. And then things like ASD, ADHD, sometimes the schools can identify like traits of that. And then what they'll do is say they'll either recommend outside testing of, hey, we think this kid might be experiencing some symptoms that sound like ASD. We recommend that you get evaluated elsewhere because a lot of times schools don't have the resources to do the executive functioning testing within the
yeah,
school. But as far as, kind of timing and cost and who can do what, I always will encourage parents if they can or if they want to go through the school, they're welcome to. I think the caveat is every school district is different and
yeah.
then, they kind of go based on need. So, it could be a 2 month wait at the school. It could be a 30-day wait. They could test the kid next week. It just really
Mm,
kind of depends. Um, but usually we try to do what we can to reduce the costs for parents. But I know there are other practices that take insurance. Like I said, those, I think the caveat there is that they tend to have a really long wait,
mm,
which is unfortunate. So,
yeah,
like, our wait list is not as long, but we don't take insurance. So, we do offer reimbursement. So, I would say half the time parents are able to submit it and get at least a percentage back of what the testing costs. But and I think the other thing too, like with the cost of it, like it's really like you're making an investment in your child, right? Like I
yeah.
think therapy is expensive. I think a lot of parents are hesitant to invest in therapy because
Mm,
it's, a lot of factors come into play. Like it's got to be a good fit. Is my kid going to be ready? Is it going to be land, is the information going to land? I think something like testing is, in theory, something that can happen once,
yeah,
and really give you a good blueprint of, it's almost like preventative in a way, like kind of figuring
yeah.
out how your child works before you make costly decisions.
Mm,
Um, so, but if people, so I guess like getting the testing in the school, you can just get a hold of the school and they do that. If you're in a private school, sometimes they will have the public school where you're zoned to do it, just depending on, again, like depending on need,
Okay.
depending on resources. And then as far as like a outside private practice, usually you email and they do like an intake process and you get put on a wait list and
Hmm.
um, so yeah.
Okay, so there's always some sort of, I guess, initial first s step that is
Yeah.
at least free at the point of need, and then taking it further from there might have different costs depending on where you are, depending on what service you choose to go with. But okay, that's really good. I'm sure a lot of parents are going to find at least that initial step really, really helpful to try and get that through their schools.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned it quite a few times now, and about how a lot of learning disabilities or disorders can coexist with other mental health conditions like depression and anxiety and OCD. And how often do you find that these are sort of coexisting in in a child that you test?
It's a good question. I would say, and I have to be mindful, like we work with a very specific population, so I think
True.
I have a little bit of a bias here, but I mean, 9 times out of 10, if there is a learning disorder or ADHD, there is some, even if it's subclinical, some layer of anxiety that goes with that,
Mhm.
and that can depend on a lot of things, right? Like it could depend on how much their ADHD has affected them. Like sometimes it's just school, sometimes it's just at home, sometimes kids really feel it with friendships. So I think the level of impairment is important there because I think a lot of times, kids really internalize like, why am I not doing well in school? Why do I have such a hard time paying attention? Versus, some kids are just kind of naturally more resilient. But I would say with the ADHD and learning disorders, we tend to see overlapping anxiety, overlapping depression for the same reason. Again, if we have kids that have historically done really well, they get into middle school, school starts to get harder, their friendships don't come as easier, they start to internalize. I think with COVID, that really, like, we saw a big
Oh gosh,
spike
yeah.
in the overlap because a lot of kids were virtual for a year, and that was the
Mhm.
first time they realized, like, they have an attention problem or
Yeah.
they struggle socially where there isn't as many context clues over the computer as there is in person. So
Yeah.
um I would say that's a big overlap that we see. And then with ASD, so we do see ASD here. ASD and OCD have a pretty significant overlap. It doesn't really, like with ADHD and ASD, we would see more, you're more likely if you have a primary ASD diagnosis to show symptoms of ADHD versus the other way around. So more people with, like if you have ASD, you're more likely to have ADHD. If you have ADHD, you're not necessarily more likely to have autism. There is more of a correlation there, but
Yeah.
it's more on the autism and like top down side, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. Mm.
But and like with autism, for example, like we do see the overlap with ADHD, we see overlap with OCD.
Mm.
And sometimes it's again kind of like we see behavioral rigidity with autism. Sometimes we see that same level of rigidity that shows up in OCD. So sometimes it's hard to kind of tease apart how
Yeah.
much of this is due to autism, how much of it is due to
Yeah.
OCD. Um, Trying to think what other overlaps we see. I would say those are probably the big
Mm. The
ones.
main ones. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, moving on to sort of another buzzword that you mentioned
Sure.
earlier. So you have these two different things that a lot of parents are probably quite familiar with. You have IEPs or Individualized Education Plan, and also a 504 plan. So what are these, or what are the differences between these two? Because they kind of exist in the same space.
Yeah, and I also hear parents use them interchangeably or,
Mm.
to your point, like they're not sure what the difference is, which one they should be advocating for.
Yeah.
So I guess just broadly, a 504 plan is the most broad, I guess, like level of support that is offered in a school. And I say broad because it can be anything from a child who is in a wheelchair, for example, and needs access to the building. So there needs to be ramps, there needs to be an elevator if there is a second floor. And that could range from, like a physical presentation that would be a barrier to them accessing education. It also could be things like ADHD, but it's typically some sort of medical diagnosis that would prevent them from accessing education in a fair, equal way.
Mm.
So I like to say it's basically just kind of making sure everyone has a key to the front door.
Okay.
IEPs are a little different because they follow a much more structured process. So if there is an IEP in question, usually there has to be a very specific need for that. So that could be emotional or typically academic. But in order to put an IEP in place, we kind of have to prove that the typical curriculum is not going to work for this kid.
Mm.
So, for example, kids that have reading disorders or math disorders, there's usually a supplemental program that those kids go through to learn to read in a slightly different way or with more support than the general education classroom. So, um, basically, the 504 is again kind of opening the door so that everyone has free and equal access to education. The IEP takes it a step further and makes sure that the curriculum is being delivered in a way that every child can access it.
Mm.
And it's pretty variable, right? So sometimes IEPs, kind of what I said before, like can just be, maybe once a week you're in the corner with a reading group with a couple of other kids and you're working on a specific module to, improve comprehension. But they're usually very specific with goals that are tangible. So, if there could be a goal of, this person will be reading, at the 75th percentile by June, and this is how we're going to do it. And then come June, they revisit and kind of see where the child is at. And the IEP is more, I guess, like strongly bound to being followed. So while 504s should be followed in schools, IEPs have an annual meeting where the whole team
Okay.
has to get together. It's a legal document. It's part of the school's funding that they get. So it's much more adhered to than 504s. That being said, I have
Interesting.
parents that come in and say, well, what if they only get a 504? Then what? And I usually would say, like, not everybody needs an IEP, right? Like, I think if your child doesn't need an IEP, that's a good thing because that means that they can still have accommodations, right? So, like, if we have a kid with ADHD who has a lower processing speed and maybe needs extra time on tests, that
Mm.
can be written in a 504. That doesn't mean they have to change the curriculum for this kid. It just means that this kid is going to need a little more time when there's, tests that are under a time constraint. So, I usually tell parents, like, the goal, if we want to get accommodations, I think the goal should be accommodations. It shouldn't be a 504 versus an IEP because they're used for very different situations. And they're not always appropriate for each kid, but those are the big differences. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay, so that's good to know. And so, when you are going through testing, so what are, apart from diagnosing or identifying certain conditions, what other things can you discover about a person through testing? I guess in some ways it's also other diagnoses beyond what we've discussed so far, but are there a lot of, um, I guess maybe less common diagnoses perhaps, or something that maybe parents didn't quite expect? Or things that yeah, that might have cropped up.
Yeah, I would say, and again, I'm a little biased here coming from an OCD clinic, but I would say the thing that typically surprises parents the most or that they're not expecting is if it is anxiety and it actually ends up being OCD. Or it's a kid who is, seemingly struggling in school, rereading things, rewriting things, and it ends up being like a perfectionism or an anxiety
Mm.
related concern. I mean, other than that, I would say it's kind of the usual, like maybe parents aren't expecting ADHD and it is ADHD just because it's
Mhm.
presenting in like a kind of a subtle way. I've also had times where so, like, in order to meet criteria for ADHD or any of these other diagnoses, there has to be a level of impairment, right? So, I'll
Yeah.
tell people, like, everyone has executive dysfunction, like, and everyone's executive functioning abilities fluctuate throughout their day, throughout their lifetime. If it's not impairing to you, then it's not a condition, right? Like, it's
Mm.
not an issue. Just like anxiety, everybody has anxiety. You need anxiety to be able to survive in this world. But unless it's impairing and causes some sort of distress, then we wouldn't call it a disorder. And so oftentimes what will happen is if I have kids come in that, are presenting with really high anxiety and a level of executive dysfunction that's not explained by the anxiety, right? Like there are issues or times when this executive functioning or dysfunctioning is coming up where we wouldn't necessarily expect it, right?
Yeah.
So a good example would be like if we know that a kid is nervous about taking tests and then they come in here and they do this testing and their processing speed is low, we might assume that some of that could be due to anxiety,
Mm,
which is why we look at other pieces. But if we have a kid come in who does not get nervous on tests and, maybe just has trouble following directions and, we see that sustained attention is really low, then we kind of have more evidence to show that it's not being caused by anxiety and that it's probably an intentional thing. But there are times where I will put it on parents' radar and say, like, this on paper looks like ADHD, right? Like the patterns in the scores, the areas of weakness and strength, but there's no level of impairment. So I
mm,
won't diagnose ADHD, but I'll kind of word it in a way of saying, like, this kid is, and it could be a kid who hasn't, like we say, like when demands exceed expectations, that's typically when we start to see some of these things creep up. Sometimes it's much earlier for kids. Sometimes it's, again, those kids that kind of coast until middle school, high school, and then we start to see, again, that kind of
mm.
mismatch in their environment. And so usually I'll just say, like, keep this on your radar, right? Like, this is a kid who's has his head above water right now, but like with this profile of, strengths and weaknesses, I would not be surprised if this kid started to struggle, in third grade when, essays started, or in middle school when
Yeah.
there's more to juggle. So
So these
um
things can change then. I mean, it makes sense, but it's almost with the way that the testing is, it sounded almost a bit static, but I guess it makes sense that it kind of evolves with time and evolves with as the child develops as well. So oh God, that's an interesting thing to think about then, because it means that you would have to um parents would have to be given sort of, I guess, signs to look out for, and
yeah.
would they have to then return for repeat testing?
Sometimes. So sometimes, depending on the age of the child, so like I said, if there's ever an attentional concern and the child is, I would say, like less than 10, unless it is like very clear-cut ADHD, no way around it, I will usually kind of write it in as like, keep an eye on this, and like, here are
Mm.
some ways to strengthen areas of weakness now. And maybe that's enough, right? Like,
Yeah,
there are people that have ADHD that never need medication because they have behavioral modification that
yeah.
helps mitigate that. But and I think a lot of parents do come in and they say they don't want to put their kid on meds, especially if it's an ADHD diagnosis. They don't want to put their 8-year-old on a stimulant. And I
Yeah.
totally understand. And I don't have a child yet, so I can't say for myself. But so I think that piece is important, of like, okay, well, we have these specific, behavioral interventions we can put in place if in 3 years. So usually like retesting is every 3 years. But if in 3 years we're still not seeing an improvement, like that in itself is data, right? Like
Mm.
we take into account things like maturity and puberty and things like that. And if we still see some of these numbers that we would expect to either fluctuate or improve over time, like, it's even more, I guess, of a case to make that these things are more of a stable thing versus like, oh, we just caught them on a bad day.
Mm. And I guess the now with the rise of social media and a lot of people, I guess a lot of adults now who are you know now sharing that they have an adult diagnosis of ADHD, for example. Is this a trend that you've also seen in your practice? And is there, I guess, an upper limit to what age people can have, for these tests?
Yeah. So yes, I have seen an influx in people that are coming in reporting symptoms, like college students, adults, kids in high school. And I think the short answer to a complicated question is, like, in theory, these symptoms have to show that they were at least present before age 12. So maybe
Mm,
not necessarily impairing before age 12, but at like present before age 12. So again, like going back to, like, maybe we have a kid who, has an issue with impulsivity, or maybe we have a high schooler, for example, or an adult with impulsivity issues, and it's coming out like, socially, maybe they're speaking over people, or maybe they're making hasty decisions, breaking up with somebody, or, more kind of nuanced things where maybe that wasn't the presentation when they were younger, but maybe this was a kid who tended to get in trouble a lot in class for speaking out of turn.
mm,
Or, a kid who tended to act before thinking. And sometimes that requires pulling in the parents of an adult, right? Or siblings of an adult, or, a lot of times we're kind of stuck with what we have, and we kind of have to encourage the adult, like, was this a problem when you were in school? And there's kind of different ways we can ask it, right? Like, were you the child that was overly chatty? Did you have trouble, handing in your assignments. Like,
Mm,
were you a kid that didn't do your homework? Were you a kid that needed directions, said to you multiple times? So I think we've seen an influx, and I wouldn't say there's an age cap of no, you're too old to be diagnosed. I think the only caveat is like if we have someone coming in saying, I'm 45 years old, I've never had attention issues, and all of a sudden I have attention issues, I would question if there's something else going on,
mm,
like, a
yeah,
mood or an anxiety related thing, because
yeah,
typically, because ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, just like
yeah.
ASD, and those things by definition have to be present before, the child is an adolescent. And so, um, yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. And
Yeah.
then in that case, then with all of these, with sort of the behavior modifications or the skills that you recommend, would this be also be would this be beneficial for a working adult in a job, for example? And yeah.
Yeah, totally. Especially like, I mean, I've had adults come in that, maybe they have had a job for, 5 or 6 years that's very high stress. And, maybe in the recent years they got married or they had a child and their work is now being affected by that because they have more things on their plate. And sometimes even just kind of revisiting the way they do things or, right? Like a lot of people with executive dysfunction can actually show a lot of strength in executive functioning under certain circumstances, right? Like if you ask a lot of people with ADHD if they procrastinate, a lot of people will say they do. A lot of people will also say that they have success doing that. And I'm not saying that that's, the answer, the way out of that, but I think, kind of recognizing that there are things that people are going to struggle with and there are things that people are going to begin with regardless of, you know, what they're presenting with.
Mm,
Um,
interesting. Yeah. And just one last question about sort
yeah.
of the sort of the rise of social media attention on these conditions is a new diagnosis that's been getting a lot of attention, which is ADHD, which is, I believe, uh, autism and ADHD sort of coexisting. Is that something that is recognized, and how do you test for that?
It's a good question. So, from my standpoint, I think this is still kind of living in the buzzword, era of, I think there's been a lot more recognition of ADHD symptoms, a lot more recognition of autism symptoms. There is a lot of overlap between the two, so I totally understand where that term comes from and why
Mm,
people kind of resonate with both. I think the extent to which people maybe over identify or um I guess kind of like misunderstand like what certain symptoms are because of social media. I see, an uptick in that. Like I will have teenagers come in and say, like they were talking about something at lunch and I didn't understand what they were talking about and so I must have autism because I
mm,
wasn't understanding the social context. And
yeah.
and sometimes with ADHD, like you miss social context because you're not paying attention, right? Or you're thinking about something else and you miss part of the conversation. And so, oftentimes if it is, someone coming in and they're describing, this symptom that they feel like places emphasis on both. Sometimes that is the case, but oftentimes, like hyper focusing, for example, like I think
Mm,
that's a very common thing that people self-identify with. And I think there's a difference between, hyper focusing in the sense of like somebody with autism might, hyper focus or might show more of a narrow set of interests than somebody with ADHD or somebody who's neurotypical versus somebody with ADHD. It's not so much hyper focusing, it's more that difficulty with cognitive shifting, which again,
mm,
we see that with autism as well, but the function of it is slightly different.
mm.
Or like sensory sensitivities, for example. Like a lot
Yeah.
of people with ADHD will report sensory sensitivities, or, they get really worked up about certain noises. And
Mm,
the difference there is, again, if we're looking at purely autism, there tends to be either an oversensitivity to certain sensory modalities like touch or sound, or undersensitivity. So like temperature, for example. Like sometimes kids with autism aren't as affected by the extremes in temperature as other people are for whatever reason. Um, and with ADHD, with that sensory kind of sensitivity, it's more, I guess, like more of like that's taking your attention, right? So like, oh, I can't, do this test because there's this noise in the background and that's all I'm going to focus on.
Mm,
So it's more of like trouble filtering out a sensory experience versus like this over or under sensitivity to it. If that makes sense.
yeah. So it
So
is it's sort of it's a still a gray area kind of
I
question.
think it's still a gray area. I am curious to see because I think those like the prevalence and the presence of some of these numbers is going to change
Mm,
because I think there is more diagnostic tools and even just kind of being more open about mental health than we were 10 or 20 years ago. I
yeah.
do think some of these numbers are lower than what's real. But I do think that social media is kind of fueling and even like I mean I've seen some of the videos myself. Like I think sometimes with these like ADHD or autism or ADHD videos, there's people on the internet that are kind of pathologizing things that are normal human experiences, right? So like, oh, this very bizarre thing happened to me, but that's just my autism. And it's like, no, that's a pretty normal experience that people have. And, so I'm very cautious, especially, I mean, I see people for therapy that come in and tell me they
Mm,
saw things on TikTok and my patients know my reaction to that when they tell me that. But I mean, it's like I said, for better or for worse, I think it's on the internet. I'm glad it's
yeah.
getting the attention that it deserves because I do think it's kind of minimalizing some of the stigma that it used to have. But I think
Mm,
it's in some way being over identified with
of
in a
course.
way that's not helpful. Because I mean, ADHD and
Yeah.
autism are they can be pretty serious diagnoses, right? Like
Yeah.
they require a lifelong, kind of awareness of it and
Hmm.
these aren't things, medication can help with ADHD, but it's not the be all end all. There's a lot of behavioral modifications that need to be put in place, a lot of planning, a lot of
Yeah.
awareness that needs to be built. So,
Mm,
I'm pretty, I guess, conservative when diagnosing those things because it's a lifelong condition that
of
you're
course.
telling someone they have. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. This has been so informative, so interesting. Thank you so much for your time.
thank you.
And thank you for talking me through all of this very, very interesting and intricate side of ADHD and testing.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you very much.